managed to get together. Thank you. Thank you for being here. We are here to discuss a truly remarkable work, Beyond Regimes, China and India Compared, edited, one of the editors is with us here today, Dr. Duara. It compares society and state relations actually in India and China, and does so with using a method of convergent comparison which is rare, which has been applied maybe in other cases, but not in our case. And for me, frankly, I was so happy to see a book which didn't go on and on about two different political systems and the whole history of the boundary and the 1962 war. But it actually takes you to what is much more fundamental, to the nature of how the state and society interact with each other in terms of public goods, in terms of the provision of services, in terms of civil rights, citizenship, protest, and labor relations. I mean, the list is very long, actually, when you look at what the book covers. But I think to begin with, I'll ask Prasenjit to maybe describe the book to us and to tell us about how he managed to put together this remarkable work. And after that, I thought I'd ask our two discussants to give us their views after having read it, and then open it up to a discussion from the floor. I think chairman should be seen, not heard. So.
But I think in this case, the chairman should be heard of from much more than editor of this work who was involved with it some years ago. I don't have a very good memory of it, but I did a quick review. But thank you again very much for coming and for showing your interest. This is in fact something that my colleague Elizabeth Perry, an old friend, not as old as our college friends here, but very old friend, and I put together. She has been, she's a professor at Harvard in political science, China politics, but she has been interested in India for a long time now. And so we have been, I'm at Duke University. Before that I was in the Asia Research Institute at Singapore. And we have, and when I was director of ARI, I organized, one of the themes I organized for discussion was the nature of the contemporary state in Asia. Although I had done a lot of China-India work in the course of my career, should I be speaking to this or that? Yeah. Oh, okay. I had also developed a wider interest in Asia more broadly, and so I've been working on that broader thing. But meanwhile, Liz Perry got very interested in India-China in particular, just after my, and so actually the conference that we put together, we had about 2 or 3 conferences, and was much wider, but then she decided, let's just make it India-China to get a more specific, and I agreed, because the others seemed a little extraneous. This was the most comparable. And so we had to cut out a lot of people who were very unhappy, thinking they would be in a volume on the Asian state, but that was a bit of a price for it. I should also put in a plug for something that I remember much more recently, which is the volume edited on development, on Asian development by Deepak Nair, who it's what is it? A commemoration of Gunnar Myrdal's Asian drama, 50 years, and several of us here have pieces in it, and I've done something on nationalism and development there. But that's just a plug for what I'm more identified with right now. So that's the background, and we had scholars, of course, from Asia, all over Asia, but also from the United States and India, and we're very happy to have several people, in particular Suresh, who had also spent time at my institute in Singapore, and we got him to write an essay as well, which I think is a very interesting essay, a powerful essay. So just to talk a little bit about the volume, and what I did in the volume, I don't have an independent essay, but I did much of the introduction. The conceptual and the historical part of the introduction was done by me, and Liz Perry, who does have a major contribution in the book, did the preview of the book and has very insightful commentary on the future, which I think would be certainly something you can judge over time, right? So now we all know that these are very different regimes and very different societies, but I think they are still very comparable. And their comparability really comes not so much from an internal thing, but really from what I have developed an idea of circulatory histories, right? So what is circulatory history? And this is one of the fundamental concepts that we organize the book around. And circulatory history is one where historical forces emerge from one part of the world, one society, go to another in many different ways, whether it's microbes or whether it's ideas. You know about Buddhism and how it's circulated, but it's a much more fundamental factor in history than histories of nations and societies have allowed us to imagine. And I think this gives us a very interesting entry into how to compare societies which have some comparability but are so different also, like China and India, which I think we presume. And how do you compare that? And what we use is, I have developed the notion of convergent comparison, where, just to put it very simply, the idea of convergent comparison is one, it refers to a space, or the space where circulatory global forces meet particular entities, whether it's a nation or an institution or a subnation or a region or whatever. This is the space where it meets. That is the space of convergent comparison. And how the entities react to that force is the basis of comparison. So how do they react to different things? And it occurred to me slowly, as I've been a Chinese historian for many decades, and what it dawned on me that, of course, there are many parallels and connections between China and India, but starting from about 150 years ago, at the time of our Sepoy, that's an old-fashioned word, our 1857 War of Independence, and the Taiping Rebellion, you begin to see many global parallels between China and India. So just to give you a very simple idea, soon after the restructuring regimes that came into force, of course, allowed civil society and modern public sphere to appear in both societies, and these both react in very similar kinds of ways. So politically, you see that the moderates in India, who sort of want, of course, very British-style government, are very parallel to the constitutional monarchists in China, who also expect the state to conduct the reforms. These are succeeded by extremists in India at roughly the same time that the revolutionaries take over nationalism in China. Then you get the mass movements in the 1910s and 20s, Gandhi, Mao, and the communists at the same time. Then you get import substitution strategies in both kinds of places. Then you get liberalization and Kaifang and so on within 10-15 years of each other, right? So they're responding to something. They're responding to something, and at each point you can have some comparability of how they respond. So that's the basic strategy. Now, the second concept, and if you think of it, nations now are beginning to look much more like each other than the relationship between, say, peasants and intellectuals within a nation, right? You may have much more in common with the professionals in your area than you have perhaps with your own people. Whenever I tell this to the Chinese, they get a little upset, but then they recognize it, And but the second important concept that structures the book is the understanding of different periods of change as critical to comparability, right? So the stimuli from outside can appear at a particular period. So, and looking at that stimuli, you have comparability is enabled within that time frame, right? Because they're responding within a certain time frame. But the time frame problem is more complex because we have traditionally used the idea of periods, right? But periods imply largely the beginning and the end of something. So we use the notion of temporalities, right? And what is a temporality? A temporality is that something may have been stimulated and becomes the dominant mode, right, in a certain time period. But that dominant mode produces certain problems and so on, whether it's nation building or state building, which doesn't go away. But at a second temporality, when you have some other dominant force, then those ideas begin to work themselves or become entwined with the new dominant problem. So the problem of poverty doesn't go away, but it becomes changed in a time when there is a different temporality, right? So we decided that there are state and society relations, we will demarcate three temporalities which would make for comparability. The first one is the temporality one is the early period of state struggles for state and nation building, right? So this is the period when you have Tibet and various parts of China that have to be consolidated. In India, of course, you have all kinds of nation building, state building problems, whether it's linguistic or and so on. So what is the comparability there? But the dominant problems are of really creating a state formation and building the nation in relation to that. The second temporality, we don't get precise dates to these, but really appears in the 70s and 80s, which is something that is embedded in the first temporality, but really comes to fore in the second temporality, which is the logic of citizenship and rights. And here we have several essays which deal with how both in China, we don't think of the problem of rights and citizenship in China, but it becomes a very important issue, especially in the legal senses and so on, by the 80s and 90s, and of course in India. Temporality 3, of course, is the period that is characteristic to call the period of neoliberalization and globalization. But here also you have within 10, 12 years a certain comparability. New motifs appear which absorb older problems, right, within their formulation. So let me give you an idea of some of the papers before I... most of the essays have a strong contemporary angle, but they're dependent on trends emergent in earlier periods. So the two essays on labor by Suresh and by Mark Frazier, who was here just till yesterday, but he couldn't make it till today. It would have been very good to have him too. They both do comparative essays on China, India, labor processes. And they really emanate from that first temporality because they're the labor that builds the nation. They're the labor that builds the nation and the state, right? And so what is there? They're physically. And of course, their fortune and their circumstances change in interesting parallel ways, all the way through all three temporalities. So that's a very interesting set of papers. They all are. I don't want to privilege any one of them, but you can see that very much. And we begin with that thing. Then you have the essays by Sanjay Ruparelia and Manjusha, right? Manjusha Nair, on also, I'm not going to talk about each one of them. It's about civil rights and legal and civil rights and responsibilities of different levels and agencies of the state. And this becomes very important from the 80s and 90s, especially after the emergency in India, after opening up in China, and what kinds of ways in which they are, how society actually deploys state ideas. So one of the very interesting ideas that they all talk about is how, in China you have the idea of the central state is the grandfather and the local state is the father. And so you can always use grandfather against father, right? And it's very interesting not when people deploy it, which is common enough, but when the state actually deploys it, right? When they abolished taxes in 2006, it was really grandfather saying, we are the good guys, go after those guys, the local state kind of thing. But remarkably, similar things happening, as Manisha Nair shows, in India as well, in UP and places like that. Okay, so, and this phase also carries on to the third temporality, which has to do with citizenship of the new media, and this is a very, how do we conceive of citizenship through the new media and so on. Then we have the essays by Nara Dillon on welfare, and Elizabeth Perry and Devesh Kapoor on higher education, which mostly appeared in the third temporality, right? But Devesh's essay, I think, is very much linked to, should be seen very much as continuing from even phase one, because one of his arguments, or at least phase two, because he's really talking about a kind of democratic clientelism in India, where politicians see or use universities as patronage apparatus. And so it becomes stuck in that kind of mode. Whereas China really develops something new in the third phase, where they have these very, there is a lot of hierarchy of Chinese universities, but they are truly globally achieving, and they are cut off from all kinds of vested interests, except for educational ones. So this is Dillon's paper, I think, is the most encouraging of the lot, as she sees how China and India respond more recently to World Bank ideas of welfare based upon ideas of human formation, human capital and human capital formation. And she sees that they have transformed from welfare laggards to welfare leaders in many ways, through the adoption of new programs designed to achieve universal coverage, something that we're beginning to see now. But this is really a third phase thing. It's interesting to see how and why it occurs at this time and how it blends with the new ideology. Then we have a paper by Minye on recent FDI, especially from the diaspora. Shows much greater investment in China, of course, but maybe that may be changing already. And there's also a very interesting essay by Kelly Tsai, who links historical coastal trading and entrepreneurial communities. So from South China, you have Guangdong and Fujian and so on. And from India, you have Gujarat and Kerala and other places. But it's not only that. What it shows is how they have recovered, that these were historical trading communities, but there's a certain temporality in this period that has actually regenerated these older structures and can play a role, right? So for me, it's a very interesting conceptual thing about how this can happen. And both the foreign investment and the Kelly Tsai paper compare very much the role of local agencies, provincial entities, and initiatives in the current situation. So I'll leave it at that. I've probably spoken much longer than I should have, but.
Thank you. There's a lot of questions. I'm sure the audience will have more to ask. Thank you. Maybe now we'll turn to Dr. Sonika Gupta, who's Professor of Chinese Studies at the IIT in Madras.
First, I must thank the ICS for calling me all the way from Chennai. I'm most happy to be here because I see many familiar people, former teachers, former colleagues, and it's very nice for me to be here, especially talking about this book. This book gives us a way of looking at India and China, like Ambassador Menon said, that is away from a lot of the scholarship that has been produced, especially in India. And that has been held hostage in many ways to either the way of looking at China as completely as an adversary, and therefore not comparable to India in terms of what our goals are, what our developmental challenges are, or looking at what can we learn from China. And actually, the latter part of it is fairly frustrating because what we can learn from China is a question one would ask if one was comparable in every aspect of your history and of your developmental challenges, so to speak. And what this book does is it breaks down these things in a very, very accessible way. So it gives us a new way of imagining how you imagine this most populous region in the world. And it does it in terms of the politics of the processes and institutions. And it has a lens, which is a historian's lens in many cases. I don't know if everybody in here is a historian.
No.
But in many cases,
I may be the only one.
but it has linked back to, as Professor Duara was saying, the forces of circulatory history, and each of the authors makes references to it. Sometimes a bit mischievously so, but they do. So they have engaged. Yes.
Wit on them.
And what the book is, the concept of convergent comparison that Professor Duara spoke about. What it allows us to do is, it allows us to look at things like empirical cases from labor, capital, migration, education, protest and legal frameworks. Now in any book that compares India and China, these usually are not the sole focus. So, and I'm not saying that there are no other ways of comparing India and China. There are many other ways. But this takes us beyond the questions that have been asked and not very usefully answered. What came to my mind when I was reading the book is that the population in China, and more so the population in India, they have imaginaries of each other, right? And there are different levels of these imaginaries. So there is the popular level, then there is the policy level. And I feel very impotent saying this in this room. And then there is the academic level. And in both India and China, these function and relate to each other in different ways, in the ways the countries actually shape up. So an effort like this, an outcome like this, is hopefully something that will allow people to talk about India and China in different ways, right? And I was going to talk about each of the chapters, but I think Professor Duara has done quite a comprehensive job of it. So I will just tell you some of the things that struck me. So for example, the chapter on education. What struck me is that the author points out that it is actually a counterintuitive outcome. That in a comparison of regime types, which is what this book does not do, in a normal comparison of regime types, you would assume that democratic countries would actually invest. It would be in their interest to invest more in basic education. But it's actually the other way around if you look at India and China. China has invested more in basic education than India has. The other thing that struck me was the fact that the experience of Suresh's chapter and Mark Fraser's chapter, that China found its own labor organizations too leftist. And highly exploitative of rural labor. And of course, this is not something which has not been pointed out in histories of China. It's been fairly well documented. But if you compare it with the kind of history of labor organization in India and China, one in the organized sector and one in the unorganized sector, as the book does, it gives you a sense of how little difference there is in the experience of the person who comes from the city to work, comes from the village to work in the city. And it doesn't matter which regime is actually making those rules. So as Suresh has also done, I mean, frequently labor intermediaries are the ones who are making these decisions, and these are flagrantly illegal decisions, with state looking the other way. And each of the chapters has something, to kind of a moment where you say, oh, I didn't think to look at it like this. Right? So it was a very enjoyable book to read, a very accessible book to read. I was just wondering at the end of when I read the book, that how do you think that the conversation, because the book makes such an attempt to not get locked down into comparisons of regime types. Right? But some of the authors like Manjusha Nair, she says that no, it is, I would contend it's still very relevant.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So I was just thinking, how do you think the conversation on regime types would change if we were to consider processes in which India and China are actually contending with each other, or competitive, or even adversarial? Because in this book, every case is where they have very little to do with each other, except maybe Kelly-sized paper. Where this concept of trade between India and China. But say if we were to consider things like, so a couple of things that came to my mind were like defense modernization. from temporality 1, continuing into temporality 2, and especially nuclearization. Would regime type actually become relevant in that comparison? Or if you were to look at periphery control, both countries, they have mirror images of each other, of what their periphery is, and they have to contend with the other partner in this. Partner is a very loose term here, right? Or responses to climate change, especially sources of water. So comparing a comparison that does not focus only on regime types and moves away from it, how would it benefit if we were to compare how they have performed as systems, as institutions, as processes in areas where they're actually not either irrelevant to each other or mainly cooperative, but possibly competitive or even conflictual. So I think I will stop there.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. I turn now to Professor T.G. Suresh, who is Professor of Political Studies in JNU, who has a paper in the book on labor and state absenteeism.
Thanks. Actually, I'm not able to hide my, how delightful I am to be part of this book. If I'm not looking very excited, it's just because of cold that I'm suffering. Because I will also, I'll be very brief because I have contributed a chapter and I wanted to listen from others. I'll be a little self-reflective because for a long time as someone who wanted to study and learn China, one of these, I in particular grew up with this enduring image of, this regime type or a particular governmental model, largely influencing the historical destinies of people, both in India and China, and the differences in terms of, levels of development, the living standard that people have achieved, and the diffusion of, say, income throughout these regions are basically both scholars as well as commentators tend to make the type of regime as accountable for all this. This was something that even say this was kind of an unproblematic formulation, say 20 years ago, and there was this idea that there is this, in particular, especially I remember the conversation with earlier, say China, scholars, where this idea of how China's a deeply transformative process led to certain social outcome, in particular in the redistributive dynamism, which India, could not achieve. But this book is in fact not really, seeks to say dispense with this, the regime type and their consequences. But at the same time, it in fact alerts us about the fact that both India and China, if I use the word embedded, and that may not be entirely, I'm still searching for a word, for an expression to say that India and China are actually situated in a global economy, global society, and this is the one, and then Prasenjit Duara's, and Perry's introduction, which actually was very helpful since it was circulated during the time of, we are all writing the chapters, was quite helpful because it helped many of us to say, come out of this, inadvertent conceptual stalemate that many people had, experienced. That this is the how do we explain differences in terms of all this is basically the regime type. Whatever the adjective that one may prefer to use, say for example about China, like a one-party rule or authoritarian government or state corporatism. People see that, and we now know that the complaint against such a state corporatism is much muted now compared to, say, again 30 or 40 years Cold War era, and there are even say much less enthusiasm for say democracy. We know that is Indian democracy in particular was remarkably successful in terms of say keeping a society highly unified, and also enabling people to, differently located social actors to express their aspiration, but at the same time, scarcity and development was accompanied India. So this was and always this. So this idea of Duara's idea of the circulatory history, that what is happening within a nation, and nation is not entirely territorial. Of course, it is territorially bounded, administrative, legal, sovereignty, same, but at the same time, much of the social processes, institutional processes, ideas are actually influenced by factors from without as well as factors from within. And in all the chapters, when I was reading, I was actually struck by the fact that many of the details that others have contributed have given examples of, for example, in Tilland's chapter, how the idea of social welfare was, both India and China was looking at the early days of the British idea of welfare, and also even when I looked at how both Delhi and Shanghai as big cities in their emergence, how colonialism played a very important role in inducing building cycle, and we will see so many such details provided in so in that way this idea helps us to really think through processes, and I have seen in this idea of circulatory history, Prasenjit Duara had elaborated in great detail in his other 2015 book, The Crisis of Global Modernity, Asian Traditions and Sustainable Future, and also the global and nation global and the region in the nation formation, and I've seen in one thing that he like many things that I was like say some 20 years ago thought that that is a real ideal type of a linear path of development, and also stable. Whatever we call it, autarky or a stable, political arrangement. And this circulatory, the moment you bring in and recognize the fact that much of these processes are fashioned by global circulatory forces, then it opens up. It is not that no social actor is in a particular territory ever enjoyed complete autonomy in deciding, their destinies, be it ideas, practices, models, etc., etc. So this is I would say, for comparative, studies, on India and China, for to think beyond, there's a new, think beyond many received ideas. In fact, earlier studies also had thought of, looking at how to say, for example, study India and China. Can we really treat these two large nations as a single unit where the social experience of social strata in these countries can be aggregated? That was the idea. When I started the Chinese studying China, that was the idea. But then, we see in this, many chapters, new scholarship is like focusing on specific sites, region, provinces, and we see the differences between, different provinces, regions, the way they respond to, the circulatory forces and their demands, and also, in both in India and in China, this is particularly happening, and I have in my own conversation with many China scholars, Chinese scholars. They had, I feel, they feel a sense of unease with this both convergent comparison idea, and also, they want something very, the idea that development outcome and achievement in living standards are important, than except that. But now I can see that this book. I can see it's going to be, in a way, a new springtime for India-China comparative studies, because many of these chapters have potential to become, for full-length account. And since we have a new concept to think about all this, and this idea of, temporality was also enormously useful. Earlier we had this notion used by analyst historians and etc. about the structural time. But Duara's idea of the temporality is provide. It's more opens up, to identify more, maybe shorter or instead of say long durée of capitalism or long durée of something. So this, in particular in the case of labor, we have seen, as Sonika has mentioned, how say labor intermediaries are returning back to China. It's so surprising that most of the labor historians in India have say initially seen both in India and China labor intermediaries in the colonial history. And now in China, after the revolution, labor intermediation was practically brought to an end. Even during the Cultural Revolution, it was seen as a political crime. But in the post-reform era, the return of labor intermediacy, labor contractors, and all, and now it has in China it has reached a different level of you have the labor dispatch companies. It acquiring an industrial nature, not just simple individuals or rural social actors, but it acquiring huge. India is also similarly we see the same stories everywhere. Even say public sector, from banking institutions to say public sector departments in many parts of India now say using third-party contractors to hire people, and so we see say it is the models and say even state practices are say converging, and the way China has achieved labor flexibility was also in fact very tragic, to the extent to which they and that to under the control of the state, the state corporatism. So before I stop, I just wanted to mention the last, the point that I just that the other day we listened to Mark Frassiers, and beyond all this, and he showed us two photographs of a young Bal Thackeray and Chanchin Chiao of the Gang of Four, from Shanghai. Both of them look very strikingly similar. With the spectacle, young, and except that since Chanchin Chiao is smiling and he had, inherited Mao's certain teeth. State, I don't know, that's a different thing. But and also in his chapter in this book, Mark Fraser has mentioned how the labor mavericks in India and China, like Lili San in China and V.V. Giri in India, both lost power in the same period. And so, only when I read these books, again I saw how rich, these books are in detail, and I think I must say that, we were all, trying to say when this India-China studies becomes very popular in many places, many people are trying to do that. We have seen initially simple juxtaposition of ad hoc, say, statistics and etc., they were all studies. But only now we have this conceptual framework, how to think beyond it. And this, once, since I have been teaching some of us Duara's works in my own classes, in my own courses, I have seen he just doesn't say, agree with anything which is so stable, anything which is so linear. Something that I was earlier thought that is the a model, Anyway, I'm just stop it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Not a book.
But thank you. This is you've just heard a really good introduction from Prasenjit, which I hope tempts you to actually go out and read the book, and two very thoughtful comments by the discussants on the book. Let me exploit my position.
But can I just, before anything show this is a Malayali dominated. Who can? That's right. You guys bring it back, right?
So we're back.
We are back. Yes. Can anyone? Has anyone seen this picture before? You should have. Because you've seen it. It is the great photographer, Gigi Zakaria. who has done, I first saw him in Shanghai in 2010 at the first India-China, West Heavens Brother, and when one of you was ambassador or something. He has a whole series on India-China, and he's very creative. And then we had him at Duke recently, an exhibition of some of his India-China things, photographs, which are sort of, they're not straight photographs. There's a work going on here. But we found, when I saw this, I said, whatever you do, you have to give it for our cover. And so please explore it and think about it. It's a very suggestive and provocative picture.
Thank you. As you heard, this is a volume which does sort of convergent comparison, and it finds comparisons, convergence across a whole range of areas which we don't traditionally think of. I mean, welfare, for instance. Professor Suresh mentioned labor, but welfare. How both countries have actually moved from redistributive notions of welfare and social justice to market efficiency models, where we now do targeted interventions which provide safety nets for the poor. I mean, this is a whole different, and both have done this simultaneously. So in a strange way, it proves that we started reforms with similar goals, both India and China, with very different systems, but we ended up with very similar results. And it's fascinating to read
similar
this.
product.
Similar product, yeah, at the end, this outcome. Yeah, it's true. But it's fascinating to see that happen over and over again. And like Sonika Gupta said, I also, reading it, I thought of so many more places where we could look for this. Anti-corruption, for instance. And corruption
She talks
movements.
about in the
strongmen as leaders. I mean, this is new authoritarianism. I mean, it's obvious. But, the popular nationalism, I mean, the way we... But more important, how that nationalism has moved from a narrative of heroic struggle against adversity to victimhood. And our century of humiliation, we are now talking of 1,000 years of invaders. I mean, that shift which comes in your third temporality, I mean, it's a surprising sort of shift. It's counterintuitive. There's a whole set of things. So I hope you'll do a study which actually takes it beyond where we are today. But I do have one question, because, the book keeps coming back, and I think Prasenjit also in his work, keeps coming back to the larger circulatory forces, to anchoring in world historical forces, to how we're situated in a global context, as you say. I think for me that's the weakest part, to actually prove a causal link. I mean, is this just the human mind seeing a pattern where there isn't one? Now, of course, you can argue that, once is coincidence, twice is accident, thrice is enemy action. Yes. I mean, there has to be so much convergence, there has to be some, but to actually prove that link point and to find it, that I find is a little harder. I mean, we all accept it because we read it, we see the results, and for me, that would be interesting to see the actual transmission of these things. I mean, it's not the World Bank. On the welfare case, you can say it's the World Bank telling everyone what they think they should be doing, and the tremendous influence they have on thinking on welfare. But in education...
Well, that's why it's so different.
And the outcomes are different again. Yeah. So, and that is the part that I would ask for. But maybe we should just throw it open to the floor.
And also,
do you have a question? Go ahead.
I mean, not a question in that sense. Something that struck me when where you're setting up the book. So I'll just read out just a couple of lines. It says that social divisions in India. So you're talking about what are differences, and you say social divisions in India are deep and myriad, including caste, language, religion, among others. Whereas in China, the principal social cleavages are economic, political, and regional. Especially urban versus rural. I was wondering, was there any specific, I was wondering why racial was not included here. Would you find that irrelevant?
Racial is a very, very charged category. And Minzu is not really, Zongzu race. And, race is something, I mean, there is I'd rather call it ethno-racial, right?
Okay.
So, because it keeps getting redefined and re-included in it. So it's a very, what should I say, a mobile, labile category. So, yeah, I think there is very much that, particularly both towards minorities. And, well, that's another story, because once you have the move from the Maoists to the non-Maoists, the connection is made through the overseas Chinese, right? Which sort of privileges a very different concept of the nation as a Han nation, as opposed to a Minzu Tuanje, as opposed to the unity of nationalities. So that's another whole, we could have a book on that too, but anyway. But I just want to respond to the two issues that you brought up. One on the whole question of what role does regime play. I think, of course, but I think one of the things we show is that look at these regimes, they're doing similar things at the same time, despite having very different, right? All the things you talk about, defense, they're doing it at the same time, in response to each other. But partly, I mean, this is the one thing, as you say, the Chinese say that, how could you do this comparison? We're 5 times bigger than India, You could have done it maybe 40 years ago or something, 30 years ago. Well, so that's why we don't want to base it on the actual outcomes, but on what is pushing it and how the process, the convergent process, right? And so the outcomes, I think you have to, but you can see that the regime, these are completely different regimes, but doing very similar things. The nuclear thing is very much imitating. They were imitating the Soviets and the Americans, and we were imitating to some extent them, I'm sorry. But, we felt it was important to have. And peripheries, I have an essay long ago, they're very similar, how they deal with the periphery. They're more militant. We have more political technology, but, who knows now how we can say how militarized we are or not. So there is a lot of that. The point is, of course, there is a role, and it also deals with your question of the connection. Very often, you can't, we have a little out as well, because there's a philosopher called Roy Bhaskar, who's of Indian origin in England, who talks about generative causality. But there's a lot of causality that gets processed before you can actually see it. You can only see it in the results. And you could penetrate it. But for instance, the welfare things and so on, no, it's not just clear, it has institutional expressions, because the World Bank comes and talks to people in particular institutions. And they develop, these kinds of models, and often they're subject to certain kinds of things for further incentives and so on, right? So there are some of those things that are going on. But I do think, this is not to deny that regime competition is very much, but how to sort of see it. And that was your question, really.
Yeah.
How does regime competition get changed by looking at this circulatory thing? Maybe that's another book.
Floor is open. Anyone who wants to comment, ask a question. There's a mic there, so please wait.
There's a young lady.
There's a young lady in the middle of the
Thank you, sir. The question is to you,
You
sir.
have to identify yourself.
Yes, I'm Aditi Kushresht. I'm a graduate from LSR and I studied history. So my question to you is that, sir, in the beginning you mentioned that India and China experienced similar changes around the same time, and they were clearly responding to something. So I'd like to believe you talking about structures as that something. So my question to you, responding to, probably you meant that they were responding to social, economic, cultural, and even psychosocial structures which people usually don't talk about. So my question to you is that in terms of historiography, where a lot of historians have moved ahead to post-structural analysis of history, how much importance would you give to structures? Also, I have a second question related to temporalities, which was a very interesting point. So you mentioned 3 temporalities. In that, I would like to add a 5th temporality. Fifth. I would like, because 4th is almost clear to everyone that it's going back from globalization and protectionism, I would like to add a fifth one, which is interactions with artificial intelligence. What would be your view?
That is the fourth industrial revolution.
So, in terms of labor rights and other rights and interactions with artificial intelligence, what would be your views? Thank you.
Yeah, why don't you?
Maybe we'll just collect a few questions over there.
Is this confined to those who read the book or others?
Nobody is ready.
This is actually in
What's your
connection
name,
with the
sir?
comments which were made all
You have to
by...
introduce yourself.
I'm sorry, my name is Siddhartha. I'm a local terrorist.
Don't say that, you would get into trouble in China.
I just wanted to check one thing. The circulation of history, have you in your book sort of correlated it also with the circulation of power, both within countries and in between countries of Westphalian type? Because that seems to be a primary, because of that circulation, you find these differences either enlarging or converging. And I was wondering whether you had in fact attended to that in your books.
Okay, yeah.
I'm Sahai. I write for newspapers.
Okay.
On the subject of images, you just showed us a lovely image on your book. Only this morning I saw a very, very disturbing and also a very interesting image. Picture of photograph of China, a newsman's photograph, where executives of a company are made to walk on all fours because they did not meet their targets. You know? So, this has links, of course, to all manner of things. The way, if you like, capitalism or some version of it runs there, of question of morality, question of, is convergence. We see in India photographs of a man carrying his dead wife from hospital or to hospital, things like that, which is, maybe based on old feudal oppressions. But this is
New oppression.
This is new oppression in a country which has a socialist past, which explains what you talked about, very high levels and the premium attached to literacy, etc., which gave it a big lead somewhere. In a country like that, which is 5 times your size, your economy, and certainly prowess in terms of temporal prowess. So what explains that? I mean, that really destabilized me for a few minutes this morning. Thank you.
Should I? Well, on the last question, I'm not sure that is relevant to our book, but it's what explains that? What explains that is Chinese state capitalism. I mean, the fact that there are 2 forces there. One is capitalism and profit and productivity and so on. The other is that you have a hierarchical authoritarian system that enforces it, so it can do that, right? So I think that's, so it's a discipline. It's, in fact, a lot of Chinese success has to do with authoritarian capitalist discipline, right? It's a
Police
discipline.
capitalism? No.
Huh?
Police capitalism?
No, it's much more than
They call it capable of
It's, whenever they were saying socialism with Chinese characteristics, I used to ask the Chinese, by Chinese characteristics, do you mean capitalism? And they would be very shocked. But that is what they mean, I mean, we're known for they're the oldest capitalist society, since the 12th century. They have been, so I'll leave that question. But the other, circulatory and power, I have, of course, been confronted with this. The main way I consider, so I'm really, and it is very important issue, and I've been confronted, and the main way, and of course power determines the outcome, but how much and what it takes it also determines, right? So you have to look at it in terms of what are the passes of the full context in which this power operates, right? What does it take and what does it, but it does shape the outcome very much. So the regime, which is the power, can shape Chinese outcomes, responding to the same forces, much more than, say, something like India or something like that, right? So the power is important there. But if you want to talk about power much more, but that's an independent, that's a separate project. So there's a limited role for power, but I certainly need to acknowledge it much more than I have. Okay, on the young lady Aditi's question, I don't know that structures don't circulate so much, but it has to do. I mean, the principle, what accelerates circulation after the 16th century and so on, is capitalism. There's no question about it. It's accumulation and things like that, and all of the. But then it's also has a lot of structures that come with it that are not necessarily explicable just by just by capitalism. You have to also look at these other forces and how they do. And then I think something very important, when you talk about psychosocial, I don't do psychology because I don't think we can get into people's heads when you're studying large segments of people. But identity is very important. And identity is very clear and very much part of the reaction of the basis of comparison, right? It both affects, it's the outside forces that affect how identity is formed, and which then develops in reaction and goes on to generate many more things. See, this has also not been studied as much, but we have been, since the beginning of the nation state, we have been a society where the polity is determined by identity politics. The nation is the mother of all identity politics. So, you know, that is one of the most common factors that conditions responses.
Sorry, what about Shivshankar's question?
The linkage, the causal link.
Yes.
I think he answered that.
To some extent. I mean, you know, there's some things you can do. The first part I said is that you don't necessarily need to see the linkage. You can do it from outcomes, right? But on some things you do see linkages, and those linkages need to be understood very well, precisely because they link also to power. I mean, what are they? Why is the institution so receptive at this point when it wasn't 10 years ago, right? Why are they listening to what the World Bank has to say? Or why are they even paying attention to global competitiveness in education when they're not doing very much about it, right? Whereas the Chinese are doing a lot about it.
One reason in India they listen to the World Bank is because the World Bank keeps saying China is doing this.
There is circulation within circulation.
And the Chinese invited the World Bank. It wasn't imposed on them.
No, it only proves actually.
Yeah, actually, you know, a World Bank friend of mine told me, and I am a friend, he said, you know, I go and speak to every time, the only people who take my advice seriously are the Chinese. Everybody else says, let's go for the meeting, let's have dinner and so on, and then that's it. They don't do anything. Who go off and do what they want.
You need the mic?
Maybe that's the power that enables the Chinese to do that.
Ravi Bothalingam. I want to sort of illustrate this with an example drawn from evolution, and then so come to the question. That when Darwin wrote this book and so on, for many years before that, he had been traveling around the world looking at different animals, and he formulated this whole theory of the descent of species and so on and so forth. And he found, for example, that if you look at frogs, they all evolved at a certain time zone, several hundreds of millions ago, years ago. But there was a band. Not all frogs came at the same time. There was some overlap. And they came at a time in the evolutionary period, which meant they all had to have certain properties. They had to be amphibious and sort of live on both land and water and so on. But frogs also, he discovered in his voyage, the frogs that lived in South America and the frogs that lived in Australia and other places also differed. There were tree frogs who had webbed wings and they could fly short distances. There were all kinds of other frogs. So frogs were also very different. So he then kind of formulated this into the interaction of what later became genotype and phenotype. That there is environmental impact and there is a kind of genetic situation, and both interact. So now, having said this, what I want to ask is,
Now, you've kind of looked at the circulatory forces. These are sort of universal, global forces that are sort of playing out all over, and they are kind of pushing a convergence.
But they also need physical connection, which is what the frogs is
Yeah.
important.
But, and this is a sort of analogy to the genotype. But then India and China also have their local environments and their local cultural and other factors, which you can say is like the local environment, the phenotype. That has an effect. So there will be different, these effects will produce differences also. So have those aspects come out, even while you're studying convergence? Have the explanation for divergences also come out? One of them, which you pointed out, is the question of speed of implementation. There will be others as well. So how does that? How is that in the state of play?
Yeah, why not? I mean, I think I have a very simple answer. It is the whole idea of convergent comparison is in fact to ultimately explain differences based on a similar factor that impacts, right? So you begin to see them, but you know, everybody's done differences, right? And so we want to show that there are certain common things that they're responding to. And there is, of course, continues to be a very important role for internal structural analysis of institutions, of patterns, and of power and regimes, right? Which do make a difference to the outcome. But we have to see how this circulatory force also conditions those outcomes, right? So that's all we're trying to say, that you're not isolated, you have to just take that much more into consideration and see how much it makes a difference. And in some cases it may. I mean, why is it that the Indian IT sector, somebody asked about artificial intelligence, right? The Indian IT sector is very advanced, much more advanced in many ways. But of course the Chinese are leaping ahead in AI and things. That's because has to do with the educational sector, I think, and the enormous amount of investment that they're doing. So yes, I think to respond to your question is yes, it should also ultimately also show that difference. But this work is not focused on that difference. Though it does come out, I think it comes out in a lot of the papers, the differences.
Ravi Chaudhary, I am presently working on leadership issues and what's beyond capitalism. You have referred to legal reform and rights of protest. I'm curious to know what sort of convergent comparison is happening in this domain. Provocatively, may I say that while China possibly is going a little positive territory, whereas India is going into a little negative territory compared to recent past.
In terms of rights?
In the legal reform and rights, we are becoming more authoritarian.
We're converging, you said.
China is today more authoritarian than it has been in 25, 30 years.
So has there been a legal reform at all in China? That's question one. And secondly, since you have talked about various intersecting topics, what is your, have you covered the issue of forecasting in the next decade? What sort of comparison it will take us to? Where to?
I'll just quickly do the second part. The second part, I think, is something that's suggested by Elizabeth Perry in the conclusion of the introduction, where she does talk about all these forces of, increasing nationalism, authoritarianism, and so on. And there may be much more convergence in those areas. But I'd let Sonika respond to the legal and rights issues and so on.
So what the book does actually is to point out, the two authors who deal with this, actually point out how similar the experiences of the two constituencies in both these countries have been with regard to both protest and constitutionalism. And that is a counterintuitive thing. Because if you look at the fact that they are an authoritarian regime and we are a democratic one, therefore the experience of the state should be sufficiently dissimilar. And where protest is located should also have sufficient divergence from the way China allows protest and from the way we allow protest. So Manisha Nair basically says she finds that protest in India and China is increasingly located between what are traditional notions of righteous protest, which is about the moral economy of justice and fairness, and what we see today, which is rightful protest, which is tolerated by the state. Right? So, actually, in terms of looking at what the state capacity in this regard, how it has developed, is suggesting that an authoritarian regime and a democratic regime have actually created institutions and processes to deal with disagreements with the state, large-term disagreements with the state, in very similar ways. And also the reasons, actually there's convergence there's similarity in the reasons, that there was the political experience of the Cultural Revolution in China and the political experience of emergency in India. So there was a lot of commitment in both places to the idea of building state capacity after that. And that is what fed into how much space for protest would be tolerated, would be allowed. And legal reform functioned within that space. And I would, of course, totally agree that China, in terms of how stringently controlled the public sphere is, this is one place where we can proudly compare ourselves with China and say, this is a marked difference. I mean, we might get there. If we don't yeah, we might get there. I really believe it's the question of one election cycle.
It's the opposite of your...
Zia would have changed Pakistan in 10 years. 2 election cycles. That's all it will take. That's what I believe. I'm maybe sticking my neck out a bit, but that's what I believe.
That's the idea.
By the way, there's one other thing that it says which is interesting about rural protest. And in China, because of the Cultural Revolution and actually because the center concentrated on industrialization and actually exploited agriculture, left it to the local state governments. State government, local government capacity is much higher. And most rural protest is against local officials, against some, and it's an appeal to the center, which somehow creates space, what you were talking about, grandfather and father.
That's right.
And I think it's fascinating actually to read how that works and how that space has increased. But Naik.
Yeah, this is Vijay Naik, I'm a journalist. Since the book actually compares China and India and various aspects actually, does it also have a focus on whether India will catch up with China and when, economically, or whether the Chinese system, the political system which is there right now, the authoritarian system, because of the political pressures and the globalization that is taking place, China also talks of globalization, will the Chinese authoritarian regime change to some kind of a semi-democratic regime in the future? And whether you have compared anything, whether India will catch up with China economically as and when, because a lot of articles have been there. Have you looked at this aspect of it?
Tarun Khanna. You tell us about Tarun Khanna. No, we can't project into the future. I mean, you can see now already India is growing faster than China, but it'll take for this trend to continue, and there's no question. Today there was a big article on the demographic situation in China that, India is what, at 2.3 fertility rate. China is probably 1.2.
Oh, fertility, sorry, I thought you asked me billion the population.
No. 2.2, and China is probably somewhere between 1.2. So they're going to have a huge demographic bulge of very old people who are going to have to be supported by a very small proportion of young people. So if you're looking for structural, this is Schadenfreude.
Yeah, that is.
So, but yeah, okay. So, we can't project. What does Tarun Khanna say?
Tarun Khanna and Yasheng Hong, I think, wrote that famous article in 2003.
Oh, that was
wasn't it a long time now? And most of the literature after that so if you still go back, it just repeats what that said. China can't sustain, will revert to mean, etc., etc., and
we're still saying it.
And we're still saying it. I mean,
and actually, we've been saying it from 1980.
Exactly. So
when is the Chinese going to collapse?
I mean, this coming collapse of China. And every year he writes another article why it didn't happen last year, but it's going to happen next year. Don't ask us.
And we are all studying the same book still.
Exactly. Yeah, this
Yes,
is the
prescribed books.
So this is why it's important to get out of that,
Yes,
narrative, you know. Although, you know, we obviously want to know, but we cannot, and there are more interesting and important things to know
Also,
that we can know.
So my name is Vishal, and I'm a law student. From the legal question, the reaction of India and China to the domestic legal regime, we've already covered that question. I was just wondering whether is there any convergence in how these two countries have reacted when it comes to international law? Because there are two contrasting examples. For example, India and Bangladesh had a maritime dispute. They amicably solved it. India accepted the arbitration tribunal's decision. We all know what happened with South China Sea. But when it comes to climate change and Paris summit, there was a lot of convergence between the two countries. So is there a method to this madness, or is it just madness?
I'm not a specialist. So.
Madness, all right.
You have to answer this.
No, I think that whether there's a method to the madness, the scholars have to tell us. But I think, I think that there is a certain convergence in terms of these are new states, right? So very strong defense of sovereignty, both sides. If you look at their attitude to water law, Montreal Convention and so on, if you look at their attitude to multilateral, right to protect, multilateral trans-governmentalism, that you saw as part of the neoliberal consensus, it's been very similar. Which is why we work together, whether it's international arbitration, which is why India and China work together very strongly on defense of sovereignty. But when it comes to actually handling your neighbors, your relationships to the concrete day-to-day, and Bangladesh and so on would fall in that category, there I think we've varied. Now, China's practice has varied over time. I mean, China was much more flexible in the 50s and 60s in settling all her boundary and other disputes than she is today. Because I think she proceeds from an assumption that these things should reflect the balance of power rather than some legal principles by a Western Grotius or somebody, in the 15th century. Which is not a bad assumption to function on, it's practical. But it isn't legal necessarily. I think we're a little more confused in our approach, but anyway, that's another argument.
maybe territoriality is an outlier.
It's an outlier.
Yeah.
So explain a little more what you're meaning by territorial.
That all the examples of India and China working together that you mentioned, they would probably stand together as a trend or as a pattern in the way the two countries are looking at international law, except for territoriality, in which you can compare India's response as a little softer than China maybe towards its neighbors in the recent 5 to 10 years, and Chinese very aggressive.
5 to 10 years.
5 to 10 years.
Yeah.
No, that's why I qualified it. But the Chinese have tried
Hey,
to
I'm
change.
from the northeast.
The Chinese have tried, especially in their maritime disputes, to change the situation on the ground.
Yeah.
So that has been.
This is new.
Well, that's not new.
Not new.
That's not new.
So, for example, the dredging and the Sechigam Sangsha city. Okay.
Okay, let's move.
You definitely have a notice of this.
But this is a big issue. We have, and after that.
Yeah,
Good evening, sir.
Okay. Yeah.
Good evening, sir. I'm Ameya Kelkar and I'm a researcher at ORF. I just had one question regarding our colonial histories and how we have sort of moved on from that. My basic question is, to what extent do you think our own colonial histories have helped India and China sort of have a few points of convergence while at the same time being so different from each other, from our reactions to colonialism to how we have decided to move on from that? That's my basic question. Thank you.
Very quickly, this is a lot of what I've done, historical work, And I think, so I'm not sure I have a quick nifty answer, but it's very important. And it was very important in the first temporality, right? Because that is precisely territoriality, sovereignty, nationality. But it was also undone then in the Bandung Conference, which, where they thought they had more in common than they did. And since then, it's become much less solidarity on those points of convergence and competition, I guess. So I'll leave it at that.
There's a mic.
That mic's not working actually.
Okay, I think.
Oh, but how about that? Some other mic?
Shyam sir. One of the things which at least I have found quite fascinating over the last several years is that as both India and China have developed economically, the tendency to sort of regress in terms of, like, for example, in China, going back to Confucianism, or for example, in India, what you see.
We don't need to go into that.
It's in that sense quite fascinating that both countries, having reached a certain level, seem to have this compulsive need to keep regressing back to categories and to ways of thinking from the past, and appears to be some aspect of legitimization, political legitimization, that they feel that there is a need to somehow seek sanction from the past. Is that something that you have come across?
You want to say something?
Well, it's part of this shift to a narrative of victimhood. As long as it was a narrative of heroic struggle, the past was the problem. I mean, you fought the four roles. Since Liang Qichao said we are slaves to records and annals, we are just a group of men waiting to die. It was
Mr. Democracy.
Mr. Democracy. So from Liang Qichao onwards, it was the past is the problem. Get rid of the four roles, old thinking, everything, and the future is rupture. Yeah, and you need to overcome the past. The moment you shift to victimhood, the past becomes good. Suddenly, all that is, oh, we were so great, everything was so wonderful in our past. It's just these wretched fellows who came, whether it's 1,000 years or 150 years, doesn't matter. Suddenly that past becomes valorized. And that's part of the problem now. And yes, it's part of a legitimacy problem, I mean, how do you move legitimacy from, whatever. But in historical terms, you have to explain why.
No, the victimhood thing, I agree with some of it, but I have a, more structural understanding of nationalism, that it is always in tension between the modernizing and the traditionalizing, because the traditionalizing is very important for identity, right? How do you distinguish yourself from others? And, but why now? Right, in both these places. And I think because, in fact, they are actually more assertive, but their assertiveness also combines with this victimhood thing, right? Yeah. And because they can now declare themselves not dependent, as it were, on global Western techniques. So, in fact, it is more anti-circulatory in ideology than in reality. But I would say that this traditionalism is just an identity thing that is very different from any tradition that we know, right? And frequently used by states precisely to prop up identity for legitimacy.
Yeah.
But you can date it in China to 1992.
In India, less perhaps.
But in 1992, Deng Xiaoping thought that Tiananmen happened
after Tiananmen,
because people didn't realize what the party had done, and they didn't know their own history. So he started patriotic education campaigns. And that was the first time that you started hearing victimhood of Japan. Otherwise, Japan was just one more country weakening, and atrocities, all those commemorations, all that stuff.
What I was suggesting was it goes a little beyond, because you see this in society.
It's true.
Like in rich people in China going back to having concubines or mistresses. you know, that is
That's human.
almost.
No, but
No,
it's true. But it is structural. It is much bigger than just
It allows
the
a lot
state
of
doing
justification
it.
for
But
things.
an interesting.
But why do people accept it? Why does society actually go along with it? I mean, this is the real question.
Yeah, I would like to ask that as well. So in China, maybe we can explain it by saying, like, the patriotic education campaign. It was very structured. It was very
But that's
resulting.
But the people.
What allows it in India?
No, I don't know,
Is
but
it lack
it
of-
has
lack
a
of-
lot to do also with globalization and having to define yourself against globalization. And this has happened a lot with sort of, the increasing penetration of these other forces and losing your sense of moorings. I think the identity issue is very important. I think the earlier period, you had your carved out, in the period of, what should we call it, the United Nations period, right? Where nations had very clearly demarcated, if not territories, sense of themselves. And this is being sort of, and so this sort of comes in. And I don't know if secularism can still.
But identity in relation to what? To whom? To which other?
To which other?
To
To the
power which
global
is
other?
threatening you or what?
We have to do this in some order structure. See, you'll get a second round after the other.
No, fine.
Hello sir, I am Shumanta from JNU. Sir, your book has chapters on labor, higher education, civil rights and all. Sir, don't you think you should also address the health issues like health policies, the comparison between health policies between China and India? And I want to share one document that is banned in China. It's Dying to Survive by Mayo 1. Sir, it shows that leukemia patient in China has to smuggle traditional Indian medicines,
Yes.
and pharmaceuticals.
Similar.
Yeah. So, what is your take on this? Like, why? I mean, why there is?
It would be great if somebody wrote an essay. We'll publish it in volume 2. We can't do everything. We just got whoever. But I do think that that's a very interesting and important healthcare. I think healthcare in general. I doesn't Nara Dillon talk a little bit about that?
Yeah,
A little, but it's very. But there could be a very interesting, I think, sort of convergent comparison on
And that would also
healthcare.
link to what Ambassador Shamsan was going back to the traditional and how they do it.
Ayurveda
Yeah,
and
and traditional.
traditional TCM.
Gopalan, former secretary in the finance ministry. In the current temporality, if you look at the processes and institutions which are in both the countries, now, to what extent they influence the future path of innovation in the country? Because if you look at 2025, as China is looking at something to achieve by 2025, and we don't have any such goals at this point in time. Now, how these things will influence, what is the path forward you think is likely to be there?
I don't know so much about that. Let me claim to be, originally I'm a historian and still am, but I think this is very interesting. And I think, and just my sort of very anecdotal observations, a lot of innovation in China which has suddenly appeared, I would say in the last 4 or 5 years, has to do with enormous state investment in higher education and in certain centers of excellence and so on. I think in India, it's much more, also in the last few years, all these startups and things like that is much with, I suspect, much less state investment. And I think here is one area where, in fact, if you do have much more state investment, Indian enterprise structures are there, although it's less efficient, but it's there, and could really take off. I've been listening to these startup guys and so on, and they complain a lot that the climate is not right for them. So I think from that perspective, that is something that India could learn very well from China and should be.
So it will be a relationship between capital and higher investment in many ways.
Oh, absolutely. There's no question.
There is a counterintuitive example in your book,
Yeah.
which says that China, when they got their first Nobel Prize after the PRC was established, it came for a person who had done her research during the Cultural Revolution time, and they expect, they had been pumping in all this money into people who they were thought all of these rising stars, but exactly. So.
And it was related to TCM.
Yeah, so I'm not. Actually, the chapter on education made me very uncomfortable.
Very angry.
No, it made me very uncomfortable because it is such an indictment of the Indian path. And it kind of, for example,
higher education.
Higher education, but it
Forget
also
about lower education.
Yeah, because the view they take is there is nothing there, which you cannot disagree with. But in the sense of social revolution, social relevance of education, so I was thinking to talk about it and to say that there is no reflection on this is to deny the history of a lot of the student movements in India. A lot of the struggles that have dealt with the issues which don't affect people who are in the universities directly. And
that's a very important point. I think what is the social dynamic of the education?
So, because the chapter actually is building towards this, that there is this technical education in both the places, and there is no social relevance for it because it's all about learning how to do things with your hands and all of that. And both countries have so in both places there is a very situated history of looking at student movements.
But I think you're right that they're looking at it very much through policy and through the lens of the state and neoliberal capital and what it needs. Because if you look at if you look at Cao resentment in China, people who don't pass that very difficult high school exam, there's enormous, and that could conflagrate, if that's such a word. Yeah, that could really, some declines in growth and so on. Whereas here, at least we are incrementally, as always, dealing with it. That we are always doing.
Thank you. I'm Rama Baru, and I just wanted to say that...
Help.
That I think this book is very useful because we have been grappling with, especially in health, you see this divergence and convergence very vividly, and especially with commercialization. And the way in which capital flows into the hospital sector, and also the redefining of the place of TCM itself. So I remember when we were students, we were always given this romantic idea about how TCM was integrated with allopathic care. But I think kind of a reading that you have, the framework you have offered us, actually it has been co-location all along. There has been power relationships and dynamics. So I think
it was very third-class citizenship.
Yes, and I think this reforms, the health sector reforms as a global idea, plays out very similarly in the case of China and India, but with a very different base. So I think some of the work we've been trying to do and also teach our students is to use this framework. Although we keep the regime's idea constantly keeps coming back, I think this kind of a deconstruction is extremely useful.
Oh, we need you. I'm sorry, but I don't know where you were when we needed you to write the paper on health. Volume 2. You start with health.
So, my name is Qatar Kapoor. I'm a student of Balanced Comparative Studies in the Evolution of Histories. आप इतिहास के प्रोफेसर होने के नाते मुझे अच्छा लगता है कि मैं आपसे कुछ बात करूं। मेरी परसेप्शन आपसे बिल्कुल अलग है और होनी भी चाहिए, इसलिए अलग है। तो पहली बात मैं ये कहना चाहता हूँ, जो हमने अभी सब कुछ डिस्कस किया है उसमें एक चीज़ रह गई है, वाई चाइना इज गॉन अहेड ऑफ अस। हालांकि उन पर 2.5 गुना टेरिटरी है, 5 गुना इकोनॉमी है, सब कुछ है, ये है वो वहाँ पहुँचे कैसे? टेरिटरी तो थी उनकी, लेकिन इकोनॉमी कैसे वहाँ पहुँची? और दूसरे देश पीछे क्यों रह गए और वो आगे क्यों बढ़ते चले जा रहे हैं? मैं इस पर कुछ कहूँगा। दूसरा मेरा एक और ऑब्जर्वेशन है, द टू ऑब्जर्वेशन। My perception is, it is because we have the law, they have the law, right? Every nation has the law. We don't observe the law and they observe the law. whether they are forced to observe the law or they do it in.
I think you'll have to be sure.
Okay, sir. I
If you
finish.
have a question,
Okay, sir. I said my second observation, sir. Second observation. I'm sorry about that. This is my second observation. It's very important. This is historical. हमारा इंटेलेक्चुअल लेवल जो रहा है, स्कॉलरी लेवल पर रहा है, या बुद्धिज्म के लेवल पर रहा है, या आज पॉलिटिकल लेवल पर रहा है, या अभी भी स्कॉलर्स करते हैं, या फिलोसफी के ऊपर चल रहा है, राइट? तो ये रिजीम चलती है, डिप्लोमेटिक लेवल है. पर एक चीज देखिएगा, हमारा जो पीपल टू पीपल लेवल इंटरेक्शन है, वो म्यांमार के साथ देखिए, इधर देखिए पाकिस्तान के साथ देखिए, भूटान के साथ देखिए, ईरान के साथ देखिए, कहीं भी देखिए, सेंट्रल एशिया में देखिए, वी हैव पीपल टू पीपल इंटरेक्शन. हमारा चाइना के साथ पीपल टू पीपल जो है ना, फैमिली टाइप का जो वो इंटरेक्शन हुआ, अभी भी बहुत बड़ा गैप है. वो आगे बढ़ रहे हैं. अब मैं वो सिनेरियो क्रिएट कर रहा हूँ, जब वो बॉर्डर पर आएंगे तब इतिहास कैसे बदलेगा. थैंक यू. वो कैसे बदलेगा?
No, I think these were observations, but I do think that what are the number of Indian medical
We have
students?
18,000 Indian students.
Medical
in China
students.
today.
And how many of them are medical students?
Most of them are medical.
But somehow it doesn't seem to create a familial type of exchange that you were talking about.
People have never come face to face. Only army has come to face to face. That's what I mean. It is very important, man. It's going to change history.
I think we've really run out of time. Before I end, let me just ask the panel whether they want to say anything.
You were going to allow me a question.
You were going to allow him.
I will allow you a second question.
Very short.
He has a second question. One last one. Then
Only it was connected with what was said earlier, whether you had in fact in your book, it's a question, half a question, this whole business about and the transformations in both countries and so on, this which I don't entirely agree with the other comment which is about regressing.
Yeah.
This non-equivalence of modernization with westernization, and that the identity question being being concatenated, so to speak, with getting a proper answer to that question, rather than an ab initio answer. Have you made a comparison of that also in the book?
No, in my other works.
Oh, I see.
his earlier work is worth reading.
A lot about that.
You just this opportunity, with Prasenjit Duara. So I have a question to Prasenjit Duara, which is the contemporary circulatory forces. If I say that they have a more universalizing trust and orientation than compared to them in the 19th century and later, 20th century, because they have, if not always, more particularistic demands and interventions, but in the age of deregulation, is that you think that is?
Yeah, I think it's very much with the end of the Cold War, and Gorbachev always says that we thought that the Cold War was something we could then peacefully erect a new thing, but those guys just celebrated the end of socialism and released massive global capitalism, which is now continually sort of affecting each group and affecting itself. We have not talked. What I do want to do is look at climate change on this, which is the most important consequences of it. Yeah.
But thank you all. Thank you very much for being such a good audience and for asking all the right questions.